Alright, so if you haven't watched the first video, then I suggest that you do so that all of this information makes sense. This video is going to cover the first part of the second seeding. So this is cosmic history, specifically as it relates to Earth. And when we last left off, the sphere of Amenti was removed from Earth's core. So at this time, the Earth's grid is still not able to sustain the sphere of Amenti's morphogenetic field. So the higher-ups devised a plan that enabled the souls waiting within the sphere of Amenti to be able to re-enter Earth by a process called downgrading. So through this process, the vibrational essence of the race morphogenetic field could be stepped down to a slower vibrational pattern. And this was done by passing a portion of the morphogenetic field through the core of another planet in Harmonic Universe 1. So they needed a planet within the same time spiral cycles as Earth, but with a particle pulsation rate slightly higher than that of Earth. So an artificial portal bridge was constructed between the core of Sirius B, the sphere of Amenti, and the Earth's core. And this allowed for greater evolutionary options for the fourth and fifth root races. And these root races are those who had already assembled the third DNA strand. And for the most part, these races only ended up being certain elite groups, like the Atlanteans and Aryan races. And through this evolutionary process, the Seal of Pallador could be released. To those in the second seeding, this portal was known as the Hall of Amoria, and to those in the third seeding, it was called the Third Eye of Horus. And some of the soul essences in the sphere of Amenti ended up combining their consciousness with the etheric consciousness of Sirius B, and created a hybrid strain of Syrian human consciousness called the Kantarians. And the Kantarian Federation was founded much later, but it eventually gained approval from the Galactic Federation to serve as a guardian and educator race for Earth humans of the second and third seedings, and they were heavily involved with Sumerian, Atlantean, and Egyptian cultures. There was also a race that migrated from the Pleiadian star system, and they interbred with the Kantarians. They are called the Dracos. They are a dark brown-skinned race. And they set up small colonies on Earth about 4 million years ago. So there are many different races that are present on Earth during what the Native Americans refer to as the Fourth World, and this entails the second seeding to present day. Alright, so in the Fourth World, we have root races 3 through 6. Root race 3 primarily consisted of the Lemurians. They carried the DNA strand 1 and part of strand 2. Root race 4 was mainly the Atlanteans or Alanians. They carried DNA strands 1 and 2 and part of strand 3. Root race 5 consists primarily of the Habiru and Aryan races, and they carry the double helix pattern. So they have 2 strands manifested in the physical body and 2 strands in antiparticle or parallel Earth. So all second and third seeding races carried these genetic segments, which they called grounding codes. So these are partial frequency patterns for each of the 12 dimensions within the 12-strand Tyrannusium imprint. And although all of the races carried these grounding codes, not all of them could activate them because of the seal of a mentee. So only the 5th and 6th root races with a fully intact 4th DNA strand had potential to activate all of the grounding codes in order to ascend. With root race 6, we have the Melchizedeks, or the Movarian lineage. And you'll notice that over the course of the PowerPoints, some of the names change in their spelling. And that's because over time, the names were pronounced a bit differently. So the Melchizedeks carry DNA strands 1 through 4, plus part of strand 5. They came around about 35,000 years ago. They are a blended race, so they represent the cloister that originally began the yellow-skinned races on Earth, but they are not limited to manifesting through that racial line. Keep in mind, too, that all of these various races carried differing skin pigmentation, depending on who interbred with whom. But I'm not necessarily hitting on all of the sub-races for time's sake. Also, side note, the 5th and 6th root races were not tied to the seal of a mentee or the seal of Pallador. So you can see why certain bloodlines have been prized over time and why certain ones have fought so hard to keep their family lineage clean. So the Melchizedeks did end up assisting Root Race 5 in repairing some genetic damage. So they interbred with the Hebrew Aryan races and created the Hebrew race, who we know played an instrumental role in the formation of modern-day Mormon Christian faith. And this race divided into two main categories, the cloistered family of Melchizedek and the templar Melchizedeks. So each had different genetic coding as well as spiritual teachings. So the family of the templar Melchizedeks established the Essene Brotherhood and the priesthood of Melchizedek, which still exists today on Earth. And they were known to have a distinctive patriarchal slant, often promoting gender subservience, elitist philosophy, and oppression of Earth's elemental kingdoms. The cloistered family of Melchizedek was said to be a pure strain, and they did follow the law of one. So about 10,000 years ago, the priesthood of Ur and the Palladorian Council were able to transfer guardianship of the sphere of Amenti from the patriarchal priesthood of the Templar Melchizedeks to a more balanced Melchizedek priesthood. So during this time, there were many violations committed against the Covenant of Pallador. And remember that the Covenant of Pallador is just the rescue mission for the lost souls of Tara. So, for instance, the Templar Melchizedeks opened the Dimension 2 portals as a way of orchestrating ascension through Dimensions 1 and 2, or the underworld, which also released souls from the seals of Amenti and Pallador so that they could be allowed to pass into Tara. So they were sort of cheating the system, and as a result, there were many chaotic forces that were released on Earth, and many distorted morphogenetic imprints were allowed to pass into Tara. So these actions relayed into some pretty tragic events on Tara, unfortunately. So there were two seals that were put in place within about 7,000 years of each other. One was the Templar seal, and the other was the temple-axion seal. And both seals made physical ascension through the halls of Amenti pretty impossible for those who carried that genetic configuration. So those souls were forced to repeat innumerable incarnational cycles in order to clean up the mess they had made. So those higher metagalactic races, like the Ra Confederacy and the Elohim and the Syrian Council and the Pleiadians, they would only release the seal for those humans who gained favor through serving the truth of the Law of One. And those incarnates still to this day have to prove themselves before those seals are removed. So the first seal to be put in place was the Templar seal about 10,000 years ago. And this was a sixth dimensional seal. And it essentially removed certain parts of the DNA strands. And those coinciding portions of the morphogenetic field were then removed from the sphere of Amenti and placed in the core of Alcyone. So this is a planet in the Pleiadian star system. So now those souls had to evolve through the Pleiadian star system for a time before being able to ascend through the sphere of Amenti and back to Tara. There were multiple distortions that came about with this seal within the second, fourth, and fifth DNA strands. So the fourth strand distortion of this seal created a polarization within the heart chakra and also a barrier between the natal capsule that separates mental and astral awareness. So it limited astral travel to the lower planes, and the lower astral identity became known as the evil twin, or in some religious teachings they called it the dweller on the threshold. And because the emotional body division occurred, we now have two levels of the subconscious mind. So the higher level held identity fragments of subpersonalities, and the lower level created a chaotic emotional force that came to be known as the shadow self, which prompted these exaggerated human primitive emotional impulses. So the temple-axion seal came around about 3,500 years ago. This was a seventh dimensional seal that affected the sixth base tone of the first, fifth, and sixth DNA strands. So the 666 became the trademark of the members of the Syrian Anunnaki, who refused to accept leadership from the Syrian Council and who would not uphold the Law of One. And this portion of the morphogenetic field was partly put under jurisdiction of the Arcturian races and partly put within a planet in the Andromedan galaxy. So this meant that souls had to evolve through the Pleiadian system, Arcturus, and then into Andromeda before they could rebirth on Tara. And due to the Templar and temple-axion seals, the concept of soul harvesting became a part of many religious teachings. And these particular affected lineages were seen as cursed from here on out. So, in some traditions, this concept became translated to Judgment Day, or similar ideas of having to pass God's test or become worthy. But in truth, God's universe is free, remember? And this isn't just some authority figure granting you approval for your next travels, but it's rather an energetic compatibility between the frequency bands held within the pattern of your consciousness and those within the multidimensional universe. So these processes of initiation were developed way back when, and there were many people who attended these old mystery schools, which were designed to assist in the ascension passage, especially in regards to the Templar seals. And a lot of this still goes on today, and there are many different forms of what that looks like. And many people of present-day Earth still carry some portion or all of the Templar seals, so they too will experience a review after passing into the astral plane in death. But we can also begin this review before death by working with spiritual principles that are in line with the law of one. And there are critical ascension periods that take place every so many thousands of years. This last ascension wave began in 2012, and the height of this wave lasts until 2022, which is right now. But it will continue until sometime in between 2072 and 2084. All right, so right now we are preparing for the fifth world, and this is when Earth will ascend back to Tara. The covenant of Palador will be fulfilled. The seventh root race will physically emerge on Tara after the energetic grids of Earth and Tara remerge. So this process includes the merging of particles and antiparticles, the merging of frequency patterns. We are bringing together the bass tones and overtones that were originally carried within the same morphogenetic field. And presently, the sixth race cycle is just beginning with the third wave of the Melchizedek cloister birthing onto the planet. And for over 1 million years, all of our spiritual traditions have, in some way or another, attempted to prepare us for this point within Earth's time cycle. Planet ascension takes millions or even billions of years, and it also takes place in waves. So when the fifth world comes about, we will have the seventh cloister race called the Unicethi. They will carry the full strand DNA package. We will have the seventh root race called the Yuanjeki, or the Parasidians, and they will carry DNA strands 1 through 5. They will be responsible for assembling DNA strand 6. They will be more androgynous in nature. And remember that this is taking place in the future, but it's technically already happening. So there will be changes that start taking place within the matter body of Earth. When a planet approaches the dimensional blending point in its time cycle, the people on the planet also undergo transmutation. So we are going to become much less dense. We are going to occupy more of our light body. And because only select portions of the planet's particles will be able to transmute, only portions of the human population will be able to transmute and ride the wave of ascension. So this is what people refer to as the splitting of timelines, and it looks sort of like a forward leap in time perceptually. So those particles and antiparticles that will be able to shift dimensionally upward are those that will have fully assembled the frequency patterns from the dimension below. So this is what the Bible referred to as our return to the Garden of Eden, or man's ascension to heaven. We are going to transcend the mechanics of death, disease, aging. We are going to rediscover immortality and our connection to God. So, members of the seventh race won't experience death, and they won't breed through physical means, but rather through the replication of combined energy fields. And if for some reason the body cannot transmute, but the soul essence is ready to leave its manifested body, then the soul awareness will arrange for the appropriate death scenario. And side note, suicide can actually inhibit this process, and it is definitely not suggested by the higher collectives. Alright, so we're going to resume back to where we left off before the last slide, and we're going to talk about the dracos for a moment. The dracon race is from Harmonic Universe 1, and they reside in the Orion star system. They have a tendency towards aggression and warlike behavior. They are expert geneticists and scientists, but they have little regard for other life forms, and they lack spiritual development in many ways. So about 1 million years ago, they came to Earth and tampered with human genetics, and they created a hybrid race called the dracos. And the dracos also carry the genetic configuration of 666. And the dracos then created the dinosaurs. So they created the dinosaurs to be carnivorous monitors for their captive human populations. And many cultures of the second seeding had to retreat underground to escape this terror. The dracos also created the chupacabras, or the falzants, and to do this they combined certain animal strains from the dracon planet with various earth animal strains. So the chupacabras and various draco descendants are still presently assisting Zeta visitors with detrimental earthly agendas. And because the dracos are members of the human lineage, they feel entitled to use the territories of Earth, even though their race was banned from here nearly 850,000 years ago. So there was other ET experimentation with the human evolutionary imprint going on during this time. There was quite a bit of animal interbreeding happening, and some of the more primitive human-like forms of early man arose from these experiments, as did some of the ape-like varieties. But human lineage did not originate from these forms. They were simply distortions. The Atlanteans were also heavily influenced during this time by the Syrian Anunnaki race. And remember that the Syrian Anunnaki race is the same race that instigated the Templar Solar Initiates Rebellion against the Syrian Council, which culminated in the Cataclysm of Tara. So the Anunnaki combined their genetics with the Atlanteans and created the Nephilim race. And the Nephilim race was an elitist, materialistic, sexist race. They operated by means of manipulation and cooperative submission tactics. And because these genetic distortions were coming about, this meant that certain Nephilim racial strains needed to be removed from connection to the sphere of Amente's morphogenetic field and redistributed. So those strains were basically spliced into the morphogenetic fields of other entities in harmonic universes 3, 4, and 5. And this process is referred to as host matrix transplants. The Lemurian or Lamanian culture was not as affected because they had retreated underground. And another side note, Earth contains large hidden caverns beneath the surface, and there are many tunnel systems in place as well. Over time, this underground network has been called different names, but for quite some time it has been called Agartha, and there are many civilizations that reside there today. But because of all of this persecution by the dracos and digressive genetic experimentation, there were several human races that came together and employed a plan to destroy the underground habitats of the Dracon and their monitors. And this went down about 956,000 years ago. They devised a plan that pulled from the electromagnetic grid of Earth, but unfortunately their plan backfired and created an explosion. So we know how this goes down. There were climatic anomalies, flooding, there was a slight pole tilt, land mass destruction, and a small period of global ice. Most Dracon left the Earth during this time or were destroyed, and most human races retreated underground. So after several thousand years, the Earth was habitable again, and the Elohim were able to swoop back in and help assist in the realignment of certain genetic imprints of earthly race strains. So the Elohim were able to motivate the Ceres to energetically interbreed with certain Atlantean and Aryan races. And out of this interbreeding came the Ceres Egyptians, and they later became a superior guardian race for Earth. This is where the Pharaoh line came into play. They did follow the law of one. After a while, the higher collectives decided to remix the Nephilim race back into the Egyptian bloodline for integration purposes. And through this merging, the Syrian Egyptians came about, and they carried the Syrian Anunnaki distortion. There were several times in Egyptian history when the ruling power switched hands between various lineages. Some followed the law of one, but there was a specific period of time when the Anunnaki decided to get involved again, and Egyptian culture digressed a bit. But about 3,000 years ago, the Melchizedek Egyptians took back over and realigned and advanced the Egyptian genetic blueprint and re-implemented the Law of One teachings. Fun fact for you guys, of all the human races to walk the planet, the Egyptians actually carry the most diversified genetic code. And then about 900,000 years ago, the sphere of Amenti was able to be re-entered into Earth's core. But of course, the Anunnaki devised a plan to destroy the sphere of Amenti and utilize Earth humans as a worker race to harvest Earth gold for Anunnaki purposes. And this was about 50,000 years later. So the Anunnaki wanted to replenish depleting elements within their planetary atmosphere on Sirius A. And war ended up breaking out between the Nephilim and Ceres. And this is what they called the 1,000 Years' War. It lasted about 1,200 years. And during this time, many Earth races sought exile in other planetary systems. Some retreated to inner Earth, and most of the Nephilim were relocated to Sirius A and then the planet Nibiru. And some races were ultimately destroyed by the ravages of high-tech war. So the Elohim and Anunnaki eventually came to an agreement, and they called this agreement the Treaty of El Anu, and they agreed that the Nephilim would not return to Earth, but would instead evolve in other systems. And they also agreed that a new Anunnaki human hybrid could be created if they upheld the Law of One. So not all of the Anunnaki agreed to this treaty, of course, and those who continued to pose a threat to Earth's security were banned from Earth visitation. And this group was called the Anunnaki Resistance. The remaining Draco hybrids joined this resistance, and this is when the temple-axion seal was applied for the first time. And the division between those who served the Law of One and those who did not became much more clearly defined in this period of time. There was great protection needed for the races of the third seeding, because the Dracos and the Anunnaki resistance desired to see their destruction. So the 1,000 Years' War between the Elohim and Anunnaki brought an end to the second seeding of the human lineage on Earth.